a black billionaire woman came to fire the maid. What she saw two poor boys doing with her twins left her speechless. She thought her maid was failing at life. Until she walked into her home and realized two young boys were holding everything together. Veronica Hale was not a woman who believed in second chances. She had built her empire from nothing, rising through industries that demanded precision, control, and a willingness to detach from anything that slowed progress, including people. As a self-made black billionaire, her name carried weight not just because of her success, but because of how she achieved it. She valued efficiency over emotion, results over relationships, and loyalty only when it aligned with performance. In her world, there was no room for excuses, only outcomes. So when Clara Jennings began missing shifts, showing signs of distraction, and slipping from the standards Veronica expected, the decision should have been simple. Termination. Immediate. Clean. That was how Veronica handled problems, yet something about this situation lingered longer than usual. Instead of sending a formal notice, or delegating the matter to her staff, she made an unusual choice. She decided to go herself. The drive to Clara's neighborhood felt longer than it should have. As the city's polished skyline faded behind her, the environment began to change. The roads grew narrower, the buildings older, the signs of economic struggle more visible with every turn. This was not a place Veronica visited, not a world she operated in anymore. Her life existed far removed from this reality. Private jets, high-rise offices, controlled environments where everything functioned as it should. Here, nothing seemed controlled. The streets carried a quiet heaviness, not loud or chaotic but persistent. Worn-down homes stood close together, their paint fading, their structure holding on more out of necessity than care. There was a stillness in the air that felt different. Not empty, but burdened. Veronica observed it all through the window, her expression unchanged, her mind already forming conclusions. She had seen this pattern before. Struggle often led to inconsistency, and inconsistency always led to failure. Clara Jennings, to her, was simply another example, a quiet employee. Reliable at first, then gradually slipping. Missed responsibilities, reduced focus. The signs were familiar, predictable. Veronica expected the same explanation she had heard countless times. Personal issues, financial pressure, circumstances that demanded sympathy but offered no solutions. And sympathy was not something Veronica dealt in. As she stepped out of the car, the contrast became sharper. Her presence alone felt out of place. Her posture, her composure, the quiet authority she carried. She adjusted her coat slightly, her movements precise, controlled. This visit had a purpose, and she intended to complete it without hesitation. There would be no prolonged conversation, no emotional exchange, just clarity. She approached the house. It was smaller than she expected, modest, slightly worn, but not neglected. The kind of place that reflected effort rather than comfort. Veronica paused for a brief moment, her eyes scanning the details. Nothing unusual, nothing that challenged her assumptions. Everything aligned with what she had already decided. Her hand moved toward the door. In her mind, the outcome was already set. Clara would open the door, offer an explanation, perhaps attempt to justify her recent behavior. Veronica would listen briefly, just enough to confirm her judgment, and then end the employment. Efficient. Final. But just as her fingers hovered near the door, she heard something, not chaos, not distress, something else, a sound from inside that didn't match the disorder she had expected. Veronica stepped inside with a mindset already shaped by expectation. She anticipated disorder, a lack of discipline, the visible signs of a life falling apart under pressure. In her experience, struggle often left traces, mess, neglect, inconsistency. But the moment she crossed the threshold, something felt different. Not dramatically so, not in a way that immediately demanded attention, but enough to create a quiet pause in her thinking. The house was modest, undeniably so. The furniture was old, some pieces clearly repaired more than once, their surfaces marked by time and repeated use. Nothing was new, nothing decorative beyond necessity. Yet everything was in its place. The space was clean, not spotless in a polished, effortless way, but maintained with intention. It reflected effort, care, a quiet determination to hold things together despite limitations. Veronica's eyes moved slowly across the room, taking in details she would normally overlook. A table with slightly uneven legs, carefully balanced, shelves lined with items that didn't match but were arranged with precision. Curtains faded from years of sunlight, but neatly folded, every corner told the same story. Not of comfort, but of discipline within constraint. This was not neglect, this was control. She took another step forward, her posture still composed, but her thoughts no longer as certain. This wasn't the environment she had prepared herself to confront. There was no visible chaos, no immediate justification for Clara's declining performance. Instead, there was something far more complex. Something that didn't fit neatly into the conclusions Veronica had already formed. Then she noticed the smaller details. Signs of children, not in the usual sense. No scattered toys, no careless disorder, but traces of presence. Shoes placed neatly by the wall, a small stack of books arranged carefully on a side table. Handwritten notes pinned in a visible spot, their edges slightly worn but clearly important. Veronica moved closer, her attention drawn not by curiosity alone but by something she couldn't yet define. The notes were structured. Organized, schedules, sacks, size sebble, but deliberate. Her eyes narrowed slightly. This wasn't typical for a household under strain, not in the way she understood it. Struggle, in her experience, led to inconsistency, not structure. Yet here, structure existed in its most basic intentional form. Not enforced by authority, but maintained through effort, and then she sensed it more clearly. Children lived here, but not as children. There was a presence in the space that suggested maturity beyond age. A quiet responsibility embedded into the environment itself. It wasn't loud or obvious, but it was there, woven into every detail, every arrangement, every small decision that had been made to keep things functioning. Veronica didn't announce herself. For the first time since arriving, she chose silence over control. Her initial irritation had faded, replaced by something more restrained. Observation. Her steps slowed, her movements more deliberate, as she allowed herself to take in the space without interruption. This house did not reflect failure, it reflected dignity, and that realization unsettled her. More than any visible disorder could have, because it challenged something deeper than her expectations. It challenged her understanding. For years, Veronica had believed she could identify patterns quickly, that she could assess situations with accuracy, separating strength from weakness, discipline from failure. But standing here, in a home that should have been broken by every measurable standard she knew, she found no clear evidence to support her conclusions. Instead, she found contradiction. And contradiction demanded attention. Her gaze shifted toward the hallway, where a faint movement caught her eye. A subtle sound followed, quiet, controlled, purposeful. Not the noise of distraction or carelessness, but something else entirely. Something that didn't belong in the version of this story she had already written in her mind. Veronica took a step closer, her focus sharpening, because whatever was happening in that next room, whatever those children were doing, was about to challenge everything she thought she understood. Veronica moved quietly toward the source of the sound. Her steps controlled, her presence still unannounced. The faint noise grew clearer as she reached the doorway. Soft, rhythmic, almost careful in nature. It wasn't the kind of sound she associated with disorder or distraction. It was intentional. When she finally looked inside, what she saw didn't align with anything she had expected. Ethan and Marcus stood in a small, neatly arranged room, their attention fully occupied. Not with play, not with leisure, but with responsibility. Between them were two infant babies, resting in a modest crib. The scene unfolded with a level of coordination that felt almost unnatural for boys their age. One adjusted a blanket with precision, ensuring it was neither too tight nor too loose, while the other carefully prepared a bottle, measuring and checking with quiet focus. There was no confusion, no hesitation. Only routine. Veronica remained still, her eyes fixed on the details. The way Ethan checked the baby's comfort before stepping back, the way Marcus moved instinctively to support without needing instruction. Their actions weren't rushed. Nor were they mechanical. They carried care, real, attentive care. The kind that came not from obligation alone, but from understanding. This wasn't temporary help, this was structure. The room itself reflected the same discipline she had seen in the rest of the house. Clean, organized, every item placed with purpose. Small supplies neatly arranged. feeding times written on a paper nearby, a quiet system maintained without supervision. Veronica's mind began connecting the patterns, but the conclusion forming felt unfamiliar, almost resistant to her logic. Clara was not neglectful. The responsibility had shifted, not removed, shifted, and it had landed on the shoulders of these boys. A subtle realization followed. Clara wasn't simply distracted or unreliable. She was absent because she had to be. Working longer hours, perhaps multiple jobs, managing pressures that extended far beyond what Veronica had considered. The signs were there now, clearer than before. Not in chaos, but in what had been built to compensate for it. Veronica's gaze lingered on the boys. There was no resentment in their expressions, no visible frustration. Just a quiet determination, a focus that felt far older than they were. They moved with a sense of purpose that didn't belong to childhood. And yet, they carried it without complaint. That contrast unsettled her. In her world, strength was measured by control, by influence, by the ability to command outcomes. But here, strength looked different. It was quieter, less visible, built on endurance rather than authority. These boys had nothing. No resources, no power, no safety net. And yet they were holding an entire household together, without recognition, without reward. Veronica felt something shift again, deeper this time. Not admiration in its usual form, but something more complex, a mix of respect and discomfort. Because what she was witnessing couldn't be explained by the frameworks she trusted. It wasn't efficiency. It wasn't strategy. It was sacrifice, and sacrifice, in its purest form, had no transaction. Her thoughts slowed, her certainty loosening in ways she hadn't allowed before. For years, she had believed success defined strength, that resilience followed resources. But here, in this small room, that belief no longer held its shape. These children were strong, not because they had power, but because they had responsibility, and they carried it without breaking. Veronica's eyes moved across the room once more, absorbing every detail, and then she noticed something small. Almost unimportant at first glance. A subtle inconsistency in the otherwise controlled environment, something that didn't belong. Her focus sharpened, because whatever that detail meant, it suggested that even this carefully held world was hiding something deeper. Veronica's attention lingered on the small inconsistency she had noticed, her instincts sharpening as she stepped further into the room. It was not something loud or obvious, but something subtle. Almost hidden in plain sight. A folded stack of papers tucked beneath a book, slightly out of alignment with the otherwise precise order of the space. She moved closer, her movements slow, controlled, as if careful not to disturb the fragile balance that existed within this home. She reached for the papers. At first glance, they appeared ordinary, documents, printed text, numbers. But as her eyes scanned them, the pattern became clear. Unpaid bills, multiple notices, each marked with dates that had already passed. Amounts circled, some rewritten, as if recalculated again and again, in search of a solution that never quite reached completion. Beneath them, another sheet, medical-related. Not detailed enough to fully explain, but enough to suggest ongoing concern, something persistent, something unresolved. Veronica's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly. This was no longer about missed shifts or declining performance. This was pressure layered upon pressure. Her gaze moved toward the small kitchen area visible from where she stood. Containers were neatly arranged, but their contents were minimal. Portions clearly measured, not casually used. This wasn't just organization. It was rationing, every resource accounted for. Every decision deliberate. She exhaled slowly, her thoughts no longer forming quick conclusions. Clara wasn't simply overwhelmed, she was managing more than one life at once. And the boys? They had adapted. Veronica turned her attention back to Ethan and Marcus. The system they had created was no longer just impressive. It was necessary. Their schedules weren't a sign of discipline alone, but survival. Time divided carefully between responsibilities. Tasks prioritized with quiet urgency. Even their emotions seemed regulated, contained, as if there was no space left for anything that didn't serve function. No complaints, no visible frustration, just quiet endurance. That realization carried weight, because what she had once defined as weakness, missed shifts, distraction, inconsistency, now revealed itself as something entirely different. This was not failure, this was what happened when pressure exceeded capacity. yet responsibility remained. Endurance. Veronica felt something unfamiliar settle within her. Discomfort, not the kind that came from inefficiency or lack of control, but the kind that came from recognition. Because what she was witnessing here, in this small, carefully held environment, reflected something she had not allowed herself to revisit in years. A version of herself, long ago, before the empire, before the control, before the detachment that had become her strength, she had known what it meant to endure. To carry more than she should have. To push forward without support, without certainty, relying only on discipline and necessity. But she had buried that part of her, replaced it with structure, with control, with distance, and now, standing here, she saw it again. Not in herself, but in these boys. The house around her shifted in meaning. It was no longer just a place of struggle, it was a place of quiet heroism. Every repaired object, every measured portion, every carefully written note, it all represented something deeper. Not survival alone, but dignity maintained under pressure. Strength expressed without recognition. Veronica's thoughts slowed, her perspective changing, in ways she could no longer resist. Perhaps what she had always labeled as failure was something else entirely. Something she had once understood, and then abandoned. Her gaze lowered once more to the papers in her hand. Her focus narrowing on the medical document. The details were limited, but one thing stood out: frequency. This wasn't a one-time issue, it was ongoing. Repeated. Something that required attention Clara likely could not afford to give fully. Veronica's posture stiffened slightly, because this was no longer just observation. This was something that demanded a different response. And for the first time since arriving, her original purpose, to end Clara's employment, no longer felt aligned with what she now understood. Veronica stood still, the papers still in her hand, but her mind no longer aligned with the clarity she was known for. For years, her decisions had been immediate, precise, unaffected by emotion. She had built her identity on that certainty. The ability to assess, conclude, and act without hesitation. It was what made her powerful, it was what made her successful. But now, for the first time in a long while, that certainty had begun to fracture. Her thoughts split into two directions. One part of her remained unchanged. Analytical, controlled, grounded in logic. From that perspective, the situation was straightforward. Clara's performance had declined. Standards were not being met. In any other case, the outcome would be final. Replacement. Efficiency restored. The system corrected. It was a clean solution, one she had applied countless times without consequence, but the other part of her, the part she rarely acknowledged, refused to stay silent, because this was no longer just a business problem. It was a human reality. Her eyes moved once more across the room, settling on Ethan and Marcus. Their movements remained steady, their focus undisturbed, as if the weight they carried had become something they no longer questioned. There was no demand in their presence, no expectation of recognition. Just quiet responsibility, carried without complaint. And that presence disrupted her, because it forced her to see the outcome of her decision, before she even made it. If she removed Clara, this structure, fragile but functional, would collapse. The balance these children had created would not hold without her. The system they depended on would break, not because it was weak, but because it was already stretched to its limit. And Veronica understood systems better than anyone. This one would not survive impact. She exhaled slowly, her thoughts shifting again. Helping was an option, but helping meant something she had spent years avoiding: vulnerability. It meant stepping beyond control, beyond calculated outcomes, into something uncertain. Something that could not be measured or guaranteed, and that uncertainty unsettled her more than failure ever had, because control had always been her strength. And compassion required letting go of it. Her grip on the papers tightened slightly, her gaze lowering as something deeper surfaced. A memory, not clear in detail, but strong in feeling. A time when she had been on the other side of this equation, when she had needed support, not opportunity, not strategy, but understanding, and it had not been there. She had learned from that absence, built herself around it, ensured she would never depend on anything uncertain again. But now, standing here, that same absence felt different. Not like strength, but like something incomplete. The boys shifted slightly, continuing their routine without interruption. And in that quiet movement, Veronica saw something she could not ignore: dignity, not the kind earned through success or recognition, but the kind maintained despite the lack of both. It was steady, unspoken and entirely real, and it created something she had not felt in years: a moral confrontation. Her definition of success began to shift, not fully, not instantly, but enough to create tension she could not resolve easily. Wealth, control, influence, these had always defined her world, but impact, real impact, was something else entirely. And now, both versions of herself stood in conflict: the one that acted without hesitation, and the one that now questioned. Veronica straightened slightly, her posture regaining its usual composure, but her mind remained unsettled. She was no longer certain of her next move. And that uncertainty, unfamiliar and unwelcome, carried more weight than any decision she had ever made, because for the first time in years, she did not know what the right answer was. And just as she began to move, as if ready to act despite the conflict within her, something shifted in the room. Something unexpected. Something that would no longer allow her the time to decide. Veronica did not move immediately, but when she did, the shift was no longer uncertain. The internal conflict that had held her in place moments ago did not disappear. It resolved, not through emotion, not through impulse, but through a decision that carried the same clarity she had always relied on. The difference was not in how she decided, but in what she chose. She would not fire Clara. The conclusion settled quietly, without announcement, without visible reaction. It did not feel like compromise, nor did it feel like weakness. Instead it felt precise. As if, for the first time, her understanding of the situation aligned with a different kind of solution. One that extended beyond efficiency into something more sustainable. But Veronica did not believe in visible intervention. She did not step forward, did not reveal herself, did not disrupt the fragile structure that already existed within the household. Instead, she began to think in the way she knew best. Systems. Not to replace what was there, but to reinforce it without breaking its integrity. Support, not exposure. Adjustment, not disruption. Her approach remained controlled. Clara's employment would continue, but not under the same pressure. Shifts would be restructured. Not reduced in a way that signaled weakness, but balanced in a way that allowed a recovery. Resources would be redirected subtly, ensuring stability without creating dependency. Financial strain would be eased, not through direct assistance, but through opportunities that appeared earned, not given. It was important that nothing felt like charity. Dignity, she had learned, could not survive under that weight. Veronica understood this instinctively now. The household functioned not because of external support, but because of internal discipline. Any intervention that disrupted that balance would do more harm than good, so she chose a different path, one that preserved what was already strong, while quietly removing what made it fragile. The twins would never know. Ethan and Marcus would continue their routines, their structure unchanged on the surface. Their responsibilities would remain, but the pressure beneath them would begin to lift. Slowly. Almost imperceptibly. The system they had built would no longer be stretched to its limit. Clara would feel the difference first. Not immediately, not in a way she could define, but gradually. A shift in expectation. A space where exhaustion did not immediately lead to consequence. Where effort was not punished by circumstance. The kind of change that did not draw attention, but created stability over time. Veronica remained distant. She did not return to the house. She did not involve herself directly. But she observed. Carefully, consistently, ensuring that the adjustments held, that the balance remained intact. This was not a temporary solution. It was a recalibration, and it worked. The environment began to stabilize. The quiet tension that had once defined the household softened. Not replaced, not erased, but managed. Sustainable. The kind of change that did not announce itself but reshaped outcomes nonetheless. Veronica stood at a distance from it all, her role invisible, her presence unnecessary, and for the first time, she understood something she had never fully accepted before. Power was not control. Control required presence, authority, visibility. But this required none of those things. This was something else entirely, the ability to change outcomes. Without being seen. And that realization stayed with her, not as a passing thought, but as something foundational. Something that redefined what she believed strength could be. But just as the stability began to settle, just as the system found its balance, something shifted again. Something new. And this time, it threatened to undo everything she had just set in motion. The changes Veronica set in motion did not go unnoticed. But they were not understood either. The household became steadier, more balanced, less burdened by the constant pressure that had once defined every moment. Clara's schedule no longer pushed her beyond her limits, the financial strain eased just enough to allow broad breathing room. And the environment regained a quiet stability that felt sustainable. But stability did not mean restoration. Veronica began to notice something she hadn't accounted for. The boys were still tired. Not in the same visible way as before, not in a way that disrupted the system, but in something deeper. Their movements remained precise, their routines unchanged, but there was a subtle shift beneath it all, a heaviness that did not come from present pressure, but from what had already been carried for too long. Years of quiet endurance did not disappear simply because conditions improved. They had learned to suppress, to manage, to continue without pause. And now, with the pressure slightly lifted, what had been held inside no longer needed to stay buried in the same way. Veronica observed it carefully. Ethan's focus remained sharp, but there were moments, brief, almost unnoticeable, where his attention drifted, as if his mind had begun to process something it had previously ignored. Marcus, though still gentle in his presence, showed traces of hesitation where there had once been instinctive certainty. Their system still worked, their discipline remained, but the cost of maintaining it had begun to surface, and that cost could not be undone. Veronica felt it clearly. Support could stabilize a situation, it could reduce strain, it could create space, but it could not return what had already been lost. Childhood, once replaced by responsibility, did not simply reappear. And that realization settled heavily within her. Her attention shifted to Clara, whose condition had quietly reached a point that could no longer be overlooked. The signs had been present before, hidden within exhaustion and routine, but now they were clearer. Not dramatic, not sudden, but critical, the kind of strain that could not be managed indefinitely through effort alone. The household, for all its strength, was now facing something it could not organize its way out of. A truth that required acknowledgement. And for the first time, the structure that had held everything together began to feel fragile again, not because it was weak, but because it had reached its limit. Veronica found herself more involved than she had intended to be. Not through action alone, but through awareness. Her thoughts returned to the house more often than she expected. The details remained with her. The notes, the routines, the quiet determination of the boys. And with that awareness came something she could no longer deny. She cared, not in a way that disrupted her control, not in a way that overwhelmed her, but enough that distance no longer felt natural, enough that observation alone no longer felt sufficient. And that, more than anything, marked her transformation, because the version of Veronica Hale who had once stood outside that door, certain, detached, unaffected, no longer existed in the same way. In her place was someone who understood something deeper, that resilience, no matter how strong, always carried a cost, and that cost did not disappear when circumstances improved. It remained, quiet, unseen, permanent. Veronica stood with that realization, her thoughts no longer searching for solutions, but acknowledging something far more difficult. Not everything could be fixed, not everything could be restored. And sometimes, the deepest impact was not in changing outcomes, but in understanding their limits. That truth settled within her, more heavily than any challenge she had ever faced, because for the first time, she was not confronting a problem, she was confronting reality, and somewhere within that reality, another truth was waiting, one that would define who she had become. The resolution did not arrive with celebration or dramatic closure. It unfolded quietly, the same way everything meaningful in that house always had. Clara's condition, which had hovered in uncertainty for so long, finally reached a point where it could no longer remain hidden behind routine and endurance. With the subtle support now surrounding her life, she was able to step back, just enough to address what had been neglected for too long. It was not an easy process, nor was it immediate, but it was possible. And for Clara, possibility was something she had not felt in a long time. The household began to shift again, this time not under pressure, but toward balance. Ethan and Marcus no longer carried the same weight they once had, though the imprint of it remained within them. Their routines softened, not abandoned, but adjusted. Tasks that once consumed their entire day now shared space with something unfamiliar. Time. Small, unstructured moments where they were no longer managing everything, where they could exist without constant responsibility pressing against them. It did not return their childhood. But it gave them something close enough to begin again. There was still maturity in their actions, still a quiet awareness that set them apart from others their age. That would not fade, it had been built too deeply. But now, alongside that strength, something else began to appear. Lightness. A subtle shift in their expressions, a sense that not every moment required control. Clara noticed it first, not in words, but in absence. The absence of strain that had once defined her children's movements. And in that absence, there was relief. Not complete, not perfect, but real. Veronica remained, where she had always chosen to be, unseen. Her role had changed, but her presence had not. She did not step forward to claim responsibility for what had been rebuilt. She did not introduce herself into their lives or seek acknowledgement. What she had done was not meant to be known. It was meant to be sustained, and it was. From a distance, she observed the stability she had helped create. Not with control, but with quiet assurance. The system now functioned not under strain, but with space. And in that space, the family found something they had long been denied: continuity. The future ahead of them was no longer uncertain in the same way. It was still marked by everything they had endured, still shaped by the sacrifices that had defined them, but it was no longer fragile. It held, and that was enough. For Veronica, the impact reached far beyond the walls of that house. What began as a simple decision had become something foundational. Her understanding of success no longer rested solely on what she had built, but on what she had changed. Quietly, intentionally. Without recognition, her legacy, once defined by power and expansion, now carried something deeper. Lives touched, outcomes altered, dignity preserved. She did not speak of it. She did not need to. The transformation was not external. It was internal, settled within her in a way that required no validation. As she walked away from it all, not physically but mentally, she carried something she had not expected to find: understanding, not of systems, not of strategy, but of humanity, its limits, its strength, its quiet resilience. The kind that does not demand attention, yet reshapes everything it touches. Ethan and Marcus remained what they had always been: resilient, but now, their resilience was no longer survival alone. It was something that had reached beyond them, something that had altered a life far removed from their own. Veronica Hale. The woman who had once arrived ready to end a life with certainty, now walked forward carrying the weight soused of something far more meaningful, because redemption had not erased what came before. It had simply changed what came next. And in that quiet truth, she realized something she would never forget. The moment she came to destroy a life had become the moment that rebuilt her own. If this story stayed with you till the end, maybe it wasn't just a story, maybe it meant something. Sometimes, the smallest unseen actions change lives in ways we never realize. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, don't let this one end here. If you were in Veronica's place, would you have walked away like before? Or found the courage to quietly change someone's life, even if no one ever knew it was you?